In a live video on Instagram, I took the baby out of the crib and at the same time showed my followers my perfect tummy. I was asked how I got my perfect body back so quickly after giving birth. Well, I'll tell you about my super diet in the next live video. I turned off the camera and handed the baby to my nanny Lena in disgust. Lena, put him away. He stinks. Who gave birth to him at all? Couldn't they have given birth to a prettier baby? I hate children, but this is a hype topic. So a year ago, I decided to find a surrogate mother. She did all the dirty work while I posted pictures with a fake belly in stories. Speaking of fake bellies, I asked Lena to throw them out immediately to make room in the closet for new clothes. And don't forget to clean up. The house is full of dust. But she replied that she would not do this. She had other duties. She was a nanny, not a cleaner. No way. Servants are servants. I threatened Lena that I would fire her if she didn't complete the assignment. With that, Lena obediently left the room. There were a couple of hours left before the next live video, so I quickly put on a short top that exposed my toned tummy. Everything was going great until one of the followers left a comment. Kiss, your stomach has terrible fat rolls. What fat rolls? But then I was flooded with comments that I would better look in the mirror first, and then stream. It hit me like an electric shock. I quickly got my bearings and said that I had technical problems. I interrupted the live video and in fear, rushed to the mirror. I thought it was the light, but no. My stomach really did look bigger, and there were some nasty fat rolls. What the hell was going on? Okay, calm down. I googled what the reason of fast weight gain could be. The portal about an inconspicuous pregnancy was the first to open in the search results, and I clicked on it. I hadn't had a boyfriend in a long time. I spent all my time on Instagram, but reading the forum, I came across some wild information that one girl got knocked up in a pool. Maybe it's the same for me. I go to the pool. I put on the first hoodie I saw and rushed to the doctor's office. The doctor did an ultrasound and said that there was no pregnancy, but there was a slight obesity in the waist area. Slight obesity? I said that I had a proper diet, and I had a couple of servants preparing everything for me. This couldn't be happening. The doctor replied that many patients ate their problems in a half-asleep state and then did not remember anything about it. I walked out of the clinic. Everything was a blur. Was I a lunatic? I couldn't think straight. I was necessary to understand everything as soon as possible, so I decided to experiment, and for this, I rushed to the store. There, with trembling hands, I picked up a jar of Nutella from the shelf. I wanted to leave it in the refrigerator overnight and see if the jar was open in the morning. What if I really went to the refrigerator at night, half asleep, and ate? A shiver ran down my spine, as if someone was watching me. Haters would destroy me if they saw what I was buying here. But some weird chick at the checkout was staring at Nutella and then at me. After a couple of seconds, she shouted loudly, "Nancy Kiss also likes sweets." God, that was the last thing I needed. I threw the money to the cashier and covering my face with my hands, literally ran to the parking lot. But this crazy chick rushed after me with the phone in her hands. No, don't you dare shoot me. I got caught in someone's car and almost fell. And the alarm went off all over the parking lot. After running another 100 meters, I found my car. Chick was not far behind. I sat behind the wheel and peeled out, almost grazing her. When I came home, I looked so bad that Nanny Lena immediately asked anxiously what had happened. Taking a deep breath, I told her about the crazy woman in the store. Lena hugged me and said that was the downside of fame. Lena used to dream of meeting me on the street too. Now she worked in my house. I took a deep breath and calmed down a little. Thank God I hid my face from the follower. But the phone started bursting with notifications. They poured one after another. Hundreds of users marked me on some photo. With growing anxiety, I opened the post and saw myself from behind. The sweatshirt I accidentally grabbed turned out to be a branded sweatshirt with my Instagram nickname at Nancy Kiss. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I looked fat in that photo. Very fat. They wrote that I was just a fatso. And my diet was a complete fraud. Followers began to unfollow one by one. My Instagram was already emptying. My life was collapsing before my eyes, and my stomach was getting bigger. I didn't know what was going on, and it was driving me crazy. Lying in bed, I didn't scroll through my Instagram feed for the first time in my life, but instead hoped to get to sleep and forget about this nightmare. All night I dreamed that I swelled up like a huge balloon and finally burst. The pop woke me up. There was a sticky cold sweat on my forehead. Getting out of bed, I immediately looked at my stomach. It already really looked like a pregnant woman's. I rushed to the refrigerator, but the Nutella wasn't touched. And I saw a missed call from John, my agent. Trying not to panic, I called back. John was casual, but he was trying to find out why my sweatshirt with my nickname was so tight around my sides. I made excuses that it was just an angle. The sweatshirt shrank after washing. John reminded me of the live video I promised my followers. In 3 days, I had to talk about my diet in a stream with advertising partners. 3 days before the live video. It was urgent to do something with the stomach. I worked myself out and drank only the hot water Lena left at my door. But no matter how hard I tried, there were fewer followers. And I got fatter and fatter. Soon I couldn't even fit into a tracksuit. When I was a few hours away from the live video, I realized that my methods were not working. Then I rushed to the shapewear store. Instagram had not paid for a week. There was still some money on the card. I bought a huge corset with it. I couldn't believe I was buying it for myself. When I got home, I laced myself so hard I could barely breathe, but I still struggled into my widest hoodie. I was completely broken, but I gathered my strength, chose a good angle, and started the live video. As soon as I was live streaming, the haters immediately bombarded me with comments that I not only had a stomach, but also my brain was swollen with fat. They were furious that I decided to show up on Instagram in such a form, wrote that they were disappointed in me. I could not resist, interrupted stream and began to sob in the next room. A child immediately began to cry. Lena came in and told me that there was always a chance to make things right. Maybe I just needed to change my attitude. I emotion screamed that she was not hired to be a smartass, so she could get out of my house. When she left, I sat down at my laptop to play Bubble Shooter to calm down, and wow, I saw a dozen letters from advertisers. Finally, they showed up. But there were reports that all contracts with me were finally terminated. I was out of money. With trembling hands, I dialed my agent. What am I going to do now, John? He was silent. And then with a sigh, he said that he had to stop working with me. Will you leave me too? At this, he sarcastically congratulated with the second baby and hung up. I needed a distraction, so I decided to take a walk. I don't know how long I wandered around the city, but when I got home, I saw that the door to the apartment was wide open. Where was Lena? Damn, how could I forget? I sent her away myself. The apartment was a complete ruin. Clothes, some garbage, and dirty diapers were scattered everywhere. The smell was just awful, and from the room came the heart-rending cry of a child. What am I supposed to do about it? I ran to the baby as fast as I could. Leo, what's wrong with you? I tried to feed him, and suddenly I realized he was so small and helpless. I began to sob softly in despair and the realization of a new feeling. My God. This was my baby, even though he was carried by another woman. How could I be so indifferent? Suddenly, Leo held out his hands to me. My heart skipped a beat. I realized that now we were the only ones who had each other, and I held him tightly to my heart and whispered it to him softly. Leo seemed to understand me and smiled sadly in response. After a few weeks, I couldn't imagine my life without Leo. I also posted photos with him, but I forgot about building a following. Surprisingly, my audience began to grow by itself. By the way, I also lost weight pretty quickly. I still don't understand what happened to my stomach. I was feeding Leo once, and I saw a comment under my Instagram photo. Lena was on the avatar. She wrote that she was glad that I gave up the fake life. Already in the PM, Lena admitted that every day she mixed high-calorie supplements in my food. It made me fat so fast. I was angry and wanted to write her something spiteful in response. After all, it was Lena who made me understand that even if all the people in the world turned their backs on me, I would still be the kindest and most beautiful person in the world. And this is my son, Leo. I stood on the bridge and asked passersby for money, telling everyone that I had cockroaches under my skin and that I urgently needed treatment. Passersby were easily sold on my fake blisters, but suddenly a strange woman in a dark raincoat grabbed my arm. I was pathetically making a learned speech about blisters, but she picked one off with her fingernail and glared at me. I tried to pull away, but she grabbed my arm with her claws and said with a hoarse voice that I was a liar and I would be damned. She blew some powder into my face from the palm of her hand, and when I rubbed my eyes, she was nowhere to be found. The next morning, I woke up with an itch on my neck. I began to scratch it, and suddenly, it seemed to me that something crawled under the skin. But I immediately dismissed these thoughts. I probably got too used to the role. I used to work as an actress in the theater, but it brought a penny. But I figured out how to use my acting talent, and now I was a top-notch con artist. Even though my mother always taught me to be honest, it made me angry. She was sick, and we couldn't even afford the doctor. I tried to save her, but in the end, she died right in my arms. The doctors only tried to get more money. They didn't care. At that moment, I was completely disappointed in people. Our house was taken away for debt, and after that, I decided that from this day on, I would treat people the same way they treated me and my mother. I would deceive them, and soon I would take all their dishonest money, which they loved so much. This would be my revenge for my mother's death. Thinking about it, I quickly packed up and headed for the hospital. There were always a lot of compassionate relatives, and I could always collect a good jackpot from it. But I didn't even stand outside the hospital for 5 minutes. The body itched terribly and there was a feeling that someone was crawling under the skin. Terrified, I ran into the hospital. Help me, there's something moving under my skin. Patients parted, and some nurse said that with such problems, I needed to pay for an appointment with a skin doctor. I immediately put the money on the reception desk. The look in her eyes said, "Where did a beggar get so much money?" The tests took half a day, but in the end, the doctor said I was fine. Are you kidding me? I immediately got up and left the office, slamming the door behind me. I could feel something crawling under my skin, like it was eating me from the inside out. I couldn't work anymore, so I went home. I was hoping that if I got some sleep, it would go away. But just as I lay on my back, it was like I was burned. I jumped up and looked in the mirror. My back was all red. What's going on? And suddenly I remembered yesterday's gloomy woman. What if she really put a curse on me? I ran to the bridge where I begged and searched for the witch for several hours without success. I wanted her to take it all back. When I was exhausted, I decided to take a break in a cafe, and as soon as I went in, I saw the same woman behind the counter. She sipped her coffee calmly. "Well, I'm going to get you." I started to demand that she take back her curse, but the old woman coldly ordered me to sit down. "I'm the hereditary witch Graham, and you've got yourself in trouble. In a week, the cockroaches under your skin will eat you," she said. What was I supposed to do now? Then the witch added that of course she could help me, but in exchange, I had to do everything she said for 3 days. I was indignant. No way! But then I felt something move under the skin on my back again. I was so terrified. I had no choice but to agree. After that, a satisfied Graham stood up and told me to follow her. We came to the outskirts to her dilapidated house. I followed Graham cautiously, and she immediately grabbed my arm and dragged me into the basement. I tried to resist, but she pushed me into the darkness and slammed the door. I banged on it and even tried to pretend that I was suffocating from claustrophobia. But Graham did fall for it. Suddenly, something rustled in the corner. I asked in horror, "Who's here?" A huge fat hand came out of the darkness. At that moment, Graham, through the door, told me to strangle this hand immediately. What? It's a living thing. Then Graham slyly remarked that I had promised her that I would do anything if I wanted to be cured. She paused, and I looked at the poor hand and held out my trembling hands. But at that moment, something moved on the floor and began to approach me. And I saw hordes of cockroaches. They began to crawl out of woodwork. I ran and started pounding on the door. I felt like they were really climbing up my legs. But at last, the door opened, and I, not understanding anything, flew out of this damned house and ran as fast as I could. I went home and tried to forget everything. Maybe it was just a bad dream. I tried to calm down, but at night, it seemed to me that cockroaches were crawling under my skin. I couldn't even close my eyes. It seemed I was starting to go crazy. Barely waiting for the morning, I crawled exhausted to Graham's house and began to knock on the door. Graham opened it, but as soon as she saw me on the threshold, she was about to slam the door. I got down on my knees and begged her to take the curse off me, and I even started crying. But Graham dryly ordered me to drop the act and said that she would give me another chance, but she demanded all my money for it. I was ready to do anything. I was bitter, but I took the phone and immediately transferred everything from my card to her and pulled out everything that was in my pockets. Graham smiled haughtily and told me to go to the cemetery at night and dig up a skeleton hand from the oldest grave. I wanted to ask how I could find the grave, but Graham slammed the door on me. It was getting dark and I was afraid to go to the cemetery, but I had to pull myself together. I need to break the curse or I'll just go crazy. The cemetery was dead silent. I carefully lit my way with a flashlight and moved along the path with a shovel. Suddenly, there was a loud crack. My heart sank and I hid behind some tombstone. These were steps. The sound was getting closer. With horror, I looked out and immediately exhaled. It was the watchman who was inspecting the territory. I waited until he was out of sight. Where was this ancient grave? The oppressive silence was unbearable. Just yesterday, I was fooling people with ease and fun, and today, I was without money, in a cemetery, and with cockroaches under my skin. Then I carefully looked at the tombstone behind which I was hiding. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the tombstone, and damn, the 17th century, the most ancient grave. I started digging it up. Suddenly, someone put a cold hand on my shoulder. I screamed and ran as fast as I could. I ran to the witch in the early morning. My skin itched even more, and I could hardly breathe. Graham saw that I came without the skeleton's hand and said in disappointment, "One day left. You won't make it. The cockroaches will eat you." And then it just poured out. I can't remember the last time I cried like that. But the witch told me not to scream. She gave me one last chance. I needed to take the pendant from one evil witch, Terry, who had the audacity to rob Graham. There was no choice. I didn't even ask anything. The cockroaches were just crawling under my skin. Where to go? I asked. At least the witch Terry lived nearby, and I went straight to her house. I carefully walked over to the partially open window and peered inside. That old Terry was snoring on the bed, surrounded by a lot of cats. God, how fat and disgusting she was. Graham said the pendant was hidden in the dressing room next to her bedroom. My heart was pounding. The main thing was not to get caught. I carefully climbed through the window into the bedroom. As I went down, the floor creaked treacherously, and then Terry stared in her bed. Was she awake? But no, Terry just turned over on the other side. I walked around a couple of cats and crept into the dressing room, where there were a lot of boxes and chests. Where was the pendant? I began quietly rummaging through the witch's junk. I finally found it, hanging on the altar by the mirror. The pendant was made of pure gold and shaped like a skull with huge diamonds in its eyes. I put it in my pocket. Got it. I was about to leave the dressing room when I heard the cat's loud scream. I stepped on the tail of one of them. I immediately ran down to the hall to the front door. I had my hand on the handle. But then the old woman screamed, and she pushed me, and I hit my forehead right on the door with all my strength. And then everything was a blur. I woke up because the policeman was patting my cheeks. I looked around, and Terry was standing there, looking sullen and disheveled. I immediately backed away from her, begged her not to cast a spell on me, and told her about Graham's curse. The cops looked at me like I was a psychopath, and Terry said I was a liar, and that Graham, her sister, con artist, had just dispatched me. She was wanted, and it was not the first time she tried to steal this pendant, because it was very expensive and was inherited by Terry from their grandmother. Terry asked the cops to take me to the station as Graham's accomplice. I swore I didn't know anything, but the cops grabbed me away and took me away. I sat in the cell and grieved. So Graham wasn't a witch, and I, a first-class fraudster, was a victim of a scam myself. I almost cried. Was I really going to jail? And the cockroaches did not go anywhere. The whole body itched terribly. Suddenly, Graham was brought into the cell in handcuffs. The guard wanted to slam the door, but Graham snapped her fingers in his face. His eyes glared over, and he immediately removed the handcuffs first from Graham and then from me, and just turned his face to the wall. Graham was about to make a dash for the exit, but I caught her and pinned her against the bars. "You're not going anywhere until you tell me how to get the cockroaches out from under my skin." Then Graham laughed. She just wanted to teach a cheeky young con artist like me a lesson, and there were no cockroaches. It was just an allergy to the powder she blew in my face, and the usual allergy pills would quickly remove the itch. So I was not sick. I was about to tear Graham apart on the spot, but then I heard voices. The police were approaching. Graham tugged at my sleeve and dragged me out of the station. Graham and I ran out and disappeared, and when we stopped, I asked why the guard had let us go. She said she was a hypnotist, and it worked with the guard. Then Graham said that she liked me and offered to run away from the city to cheat with her. We would make a lot of money together, and we would live like queens. Graham offered everything I'd wanted for so long. But then, seeing her hands scratched till they bled, I remember how I had lived in fear these days. An image of my mom popped into my head. She wanted me to be a happy and honest person, and this was what the fraud led to me. I turned and left without answering Graham. I had a new life ahead of me, though not an easy one, but an honest one. Right, Mom? Did you like the video? Subscribe and like it. Support the channel. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Emily, and I am 15 years old. Have you ever been in a situation when your worst nightmares and fears became real? Did you feel like you were going crazy, but you couldn't tell anyone? This is exactly the situation I found myself in. You know, better watch the video to the end, and you will learn how at night the worms came out of me. When I was a child, I often had the same nightmare. In it, I lay motionless in bed and watched hundreds of worms ate me from the inside out. The reason for this nightmare was due to an unsuccessful prank. One day, when I came back from gym, I opened my locker and found a bunch of worms in it. Before I knew what was happening, I was pushed into it and locked in. I screamed in fear and begged to be released, but to no avail. Worms were everywhere and literally crawling all over my body, and I didn't notice how I lost consciousness. I woke up at home. The teacher called my mother and told her what had happened. My mother took me home, and my classmates were punished and expelled from school. Justice was served. But the phobia remained with me forever. Now I'm in high school. I forgot about that joke a long time ago. All my childhood nightmares and fears have passed, as I thought. But I was so wrong. Have you ever faced fears from childhood and adulthood? Then you will understand me for sure. Once, in biology class, the teacher assigned us a scientific project on the topic, the creatures that surround us. We randomly pulled out pieces of paper from a cap, with the name of a partner and the animal to study for a month. The failure started from the beginning. I was paired with Michael. He and his friends have been bullying me since I was a child. He didn't like it either, so we asked the teacher to change our partners. But she told us not to act like children and pull out a piece of paper with an animal on it. And here, I was unlucky too. Worms. For what? There is nothing worse than these disgusting creatures. Although we were lucky, because my mother was studying them. She was happy to help us and even allowed us to come into her lab. That meant that we would definitely pass the school project perfectly. In the lab, I immediately remembered a nightmare that I'd had as a child. I didn't even want to look at the worms, much less touch them. But I didn't want Michael to think that I was a coward, because then he would have another reason to tease me. So I continued to study them. Surprisingly, he also worked hard and even became friends with my mother. And he didn't bully me without his friends. Once, when my mother was cutting up worms to explain their structure to us, I felt sick. I thought I was going to throw up. I didn't show it and decided it was because of the unpleasant sight. So when they went to lunch, I stayed to continue working, hoping that I would feel better. And I didn't want to worry my mother. But it didn't get any better. My head was very dizzy. There was a lump in my throat, and then everything went dark. When I woke up, I saw my mother and Michael, who were both looking worried, trying to revive me with ammonia. Turning my head, I noticed a broken jar from which hundreds of worms were crawling at me. I think I hit it when I fell unconscious. Startled and shocked, I jumped up and clutched Michael with tears in my eyes. I was scared and disgusted. He began to reassure me, "Don't worry, I'm around. You'll be fine." I was surprised at how kind and caring he could be. My mother took me to the doctor. He said that I probably fainted because of the stress that I experienced because of the phobia, and prescribed me sedatives. That moment brought Michael and me closer. Children's resentment was gone. We began to communicate more, went to lunch together, and discussed common topics. He turned out to be an interesting person and tried to protect me from working with worms, taking all the dirty work for himself. And everything would be fine, but there was one problem. I started having my childhood nightmares again, and I increasingly began to experience unbearable headaches. I decided it was a side effect of the sedatives I'd started taking in double doses in the hope of getting rid of the nightmare. One day at lunch, Michael invited me to an amusement park for the weekend. He said that he wanted to thank me for my help with the project. I agreed with pleasure. After all these worms and nightmares, I just wanted to rest and relax. I wondered if this could be considered a date. Write what you think in the comments. And so, the weekend came. He met me at the house and we went. I will never forget this day. We had fun, went on rides, walked in the park, and talked about everything. That was the day I realized I liked Michael, and he seemed to feel the same way about me. At the end of the day, he decided to walk me home. All the way, we were uncomfortably silent because we did not notice that we began to hold hands. When we reached the house, he turned me to him and wanted to kiss me, and I closed my eyes. Then someone called out to him. They were his friends. They started asking what he was doing here with me and if he was going to kiss me. I turned to Michael, thinking that he would stand up for me, but he began to justify himself, saying that he would never kiss someone like me, and he accidentally met me and decided to remind me not to forget to add his name to the school project, because he would not do this. I was in shock. How so? Maybe our entire friendship was a long-term plan to break my heart? I slapped him and ran home with tears in my eyes. I was broken and depressed, so I decided to go to bed. I had a nightmare all night. When I woke up, I felt a strange sensation on my body. I looked at my stomach and saw worms. Hundreds, no, thousands. They crawled on top of me and were everywhere. I couldn't believe my eyes. Terrified, I jumped up and turned on the light. They were gone. I was scared. I couldn't understand what was happening to me. Was I going mad? Or maybe the worms were in me from the day I had fainted. After all, the nightmares started then, and the headaches got worse, and the pills didn't help. I decided not to tell anyone. I didn't want to worry my mother, and the school project was almost due. So, come what may. I didn't speak to Michael again, called and apologized, but I told him that he was still a jerk, and if he told his friends that he would not be involved in the project, then let him not be involved in it. I would finish it myself. We would pass it together, and then let him do what he wanted. The rest of the time, I had nightmares and woke up at night to see worms on me. It bothered me and drove me crazy, but I decided to wait until the project was completed first. The day of project completion arrived. Michael and I stood in front of the class and talked about our work. My head suddenly ached. I decided to ignore it and pass the project to the end. But then I felt a painfully familiar feeling. I looked down at my hands in horror and saw hundreds of worms crawling over them and my body. But it only happened at night. Maybe I was still sleeping, and this was all one big nightmare? I started to panic. I tried to get them off my body. Michael excitedly grabbed me and asked what was wrong. When he heard about the worms on me, he said he couldn't see anything. But how? His friends started laughing at me and calling me crazy. And then he yelled at them, told them to shut up. Don't make fun of the girl I love. I didn't expect this from him. He stood up for me and confessed his love. But what a bad time it was. The pain became unbearable and I felt like I was fainting. I woke up in the hospital. I had an emergency checkup and found a tumor in my brain. The operation was required immediately as my condition was getting worse. After the operation, I came to myself in the ward, in hospital clothes and with my head bandaged. The doctor examined me and asked me how I was feeling, and then told me that all my hallucinations and headaches were caused by a tumor. My mother scolded me for not telling her anything, but she was glad that I was okay. Michael and I discussed everything. He promised me to stop communicating with his friends, and I promised that I would no longer hide anything from him. After the operation, the hallucinations disappeared. However, the headaches will stay with me for a while. I was discharged, but I'm supposed to be treated until I fully recover. I don't think I'm afraid of worms anymore. I realized that I was too focused on fear because I didn't even notice the disease that could have taken my life. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and let go of your fears.